everybody, I'm Kate and this is Shut Up and Show Me. This video is for right-handed crafters. If you're left-handed, check out my left-hand version linked in the description below. Got another anatomy lesson. The tail end is the end of the yarn that ends. It stops and there is no more yarn. The working end or working yarn is the yarn that goes towards the ball. It's the yarn that you work with. Because the working yarn is going to be coming up through my left hand, I like to keep the ball of yarn on my left and actually a little behind me. If I'm sitting in a chair, I'll even put the ball of yarn on the floor in a bucket. The bucket's going to keep the ball from rolling around on the floor, and it helps keep my cat from getting to the ball of yarn. Keeping it down and behind me helps keep the yarn at the base of my fingers as it's coming through my hands, and that helps me better control my tension, making my work a little more consistent and easier. So why is how you hold the working yarn important? How you hold the working yarn controls the tension or how tight the yarn is. The more tension you have, the more force you need to use to pull the yarn through your hand. The less tension you have, the less force you need to pull your yarn through your hand. Your tension in combination with your hook size is what's going to control the size of your stitches and how tight or how loose they are. Or if my hands get a little sweaty, then the yarn sticks to my hand more and I don't need as much tension. Work around, play with what works for you. And as you're starting, remember that it's going to feel weird until it doesn't. There are a lot of ways to hold your working yarn. I'm going to show you what I do with a couple of variations I use when I want to add tension. The more you'll crochet, you'll find that different variables affect how much tension you need. These things can be like the texture of the yarn, the thickness of the yarn, or even the weather. If you're using a stickier yarn with a lot of texture, you might not need as much tension because the yarn sticks to itself and to your hand more easily. If you're using a thinner, more slick yarn, you're probably going to want to add tension because the yarn is going to slide more easily through your hands. And I even find that the weather affects how I hold the yarn. If it's more humid, then I find the yarn to be stickier, so I don't need as much tension. Or if my hands get a little sweaty, then the yarn sticks to my hand more and I don't need as much tension. Work around, play with what works for you. And as you're starting, remember that it's going to feel weird until it doesn't. Before we begin, I want to point out that I'm not wearing any rings. If you wear rings, especially some with a lot of bling on them, your yarn might get caught on the rings. So you might need to find a different way to hold your yarn or take your rings off. Because if they get caught in your rings, you're going to get cranky, you're not going to want to crochet, and that's just not fun. I hold the working yarn by putting the working end in between the base of my pinky and ring fingers where they meet the palm. The working yarn and ball is towards the back of my hand. I bring the end of the yarn that leads to my work under my ring and middle fingers and then up over my index finger between the first knuckle and the base of my nail. Having the yarn come off here allows me control over where the yarn is as well as tension. If you look at my palm, you'll see that the yarn isn't straight up and down along the base of my fingers. It's up at an angle from the base of my fingers towards the tips. I hold the work with my middle finger and thumb at the base of the stitch I'm working. My index finger is comfortably extended in an almost neutral position. I'm not straining to keep it extended. It's behind the hook with the tip a little higher than the hook. Keeping it back here gives me a nice piece of working yarn to wrap my hook around. It will also help me catch the first strain of yarn as I'm pulling the hook through other loops and building my stitches. Now I'm going to show you a couple of variations that I use when I want to add more tension to the way I'm holding my yarn. You might find that you want to use these with a thinner or a slicker yarn that glides more easily through your fingers. This first variation is an additional wrap around my pinky and ring fingers. Again, I hold the working yarn by putting the working end in between my pinky and ring finger at the base where they meet the palm. Instead of bringing it under my ring and middle finger, I'm going to wrap it around the outside of my pinky finger, over the top of my pinky finger and ring finger, under my middle finger, and then over my index finger beneath the base of the nail and the first knuckle. If you look at my palm, you'll see that the yarn is wrapped around my pinky at the base of my finger. It comes over my middle finger at the middle knuckle. If you look at the back of my hand, you'll see two strands around my pinky. The first is at the base of my finger, the second is at the middle knuckle. The second strand is also over my ring finger at the middle knuckle. Then there's a strand over my index finger. The second variation is an additional wrap around my index finger. I hold the working yarn by putting it in between my ring and pinky finger at the base where they meet the palm. The working yarn and the ball is towards the back of my hand. I bring the end of the yarn that leads to my work under my ring and middle fingers and then up over my index finger just under the big knuckle. And then I'll wrap it around my index finger a second time, ending with it coming off my index finger between the base of the nail and the first knuckle. If you look at my palm, you'll see a strand going over my ring and middle fingers at the base, and a strand over my index finger at the middle knuckle. If you look at the back of my hand, you'll see a strand at the base of my pinky finger and two strands around my index finger. The first is just below the middle knuckle, and the second is between the first knuckle and the base of my nail. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to check out my other videos and hit the subscribe button below. Until then, happy crafting!